3 years into a life sentence, and this inmate already has 32 guilty findings sitting in her prison file. This is what daily life actually looks like behind bars for Mackenzie Shirilla, and why her own conduct record may end up being the biggest obstacle standing between her and freedom. Quick question before we get into it. What time is it where you are watching from right now? Drop it below. Always curious how far this reaches. Let's start with the basics, just enough to understand who we are talking about, because the real story here is not the crash. The real story is everything that has happened since. In 2022, Mackenzie Shirilla was convicted in connection with a car crash in Strongsville, Ohio, that killed her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, who was 20, and her friend, Davion Flanagan, who was 19. She was found guilty of murder in August 2023 and sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 15 years to life. Under Ohio law, her earliest possible parole date is October 29, 2037. That is the entire backdrop you need. What happens from here forward is about the years since that sentence began, inside the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, where her conduct file has grown into one of the more closely watched disciplinary records in the state system. According to conduct reports obtained through public records requests, Shirilla has been written up 36 times since arriving at the facility, and staff have found her guilty in 32 of those cases. That is not a handful of minor slip-ups. That is a documented pattern spanning nearly every category a prison tracks, and it is worth walking through in detail, because the pattern tells you more about her time behind bars than any single headline ever could. It helps to understand what daily life actually looks like for someone serving a sentence like this before diving into the specific violations, because context changes how each entry in the file reads. Life inside a facility like the Ohio Reformatory for Women runs on rigid structure. Wake times, meal times, work assignments, recreation windows, and mandatory counts all happen on a fixed schedule, and every deviation from that schedule gets logged somewhere. For someone who entered custody as barely more than a teenager, adjusting to that level of structure, with essentially no end date in sight for at least 15 years, is its own kind of ongoing challenge. That challenge does not excuse rule breaking, but it does help explain why the file has grown the way it has, and why staff have responded the way they have at nearly every turn. There is a version of this daily reality that rarely makes headlines at all. Long stretches of time pass without incident, filled with the same repetitive routine day after day, and it is often the quiet, uneventful stretches that never get reported on, simply because there is nothing newsworthy about an inmate following the rules for a few months in a row. What tends to surface publicly, understandably, are the moments where that routine breaks down, where a search turns up contraband, where a call gets flagged, or where a hearing officer issues a new restriction. That selection bias does not make the violations any less real or any less documented, but it is worth keeping in mind that the file represents the moments things went wrong, layered on top of an otherwise repetitive daily existence that most people would find difficult to endure for even a few weeks, let alone the 15 years minimum she is required to serve before parole becomes a possibility at all. Start with the most recent and most talked about violation, the one tied to video visitation. Inmates in most facilities are allowed limited video calls with approved family and friends through tablets or kiosks, and every one of those calls is monitored by staff. There is a reason for that. Facilities strictly prohibit contact with unapproved visitors on camera, and they strictly prohibit explicit conduct of any kind, because in a building housing hundreds of women in close quarters, that kind of material moving through shared devices creates real problems. It can fuel extortion. It can spark conflict between inmates. It threatens the basic order that keeps both staff and the general population safe. According to a conduct report from September 2025, staff monitoring one of Shirilla's video calls documented sexually explicit conduct taking place on camera, involving both her and the person she was speaking with. Staff shut the call down immediately once it was flagged. Shirilla pleaded guilty to the violation, and a hearing officer imposed a 60-day restriction on her video visiting privileges, the toughest penalty she has faced in this category so far. This was not the first time her video visitation use had triggered a violation either. Records show that months earlier, in April 2025, staff documented that she had logged over 100 video visits with someone who was not on her approved visitor list, someone who appeared to be using a different name to get around the restriction, reportedly a formerly incarcerated individual. She pleaded guilty to that violation too and received a 30-day electronics restriction. Two separate visitation violations, months apart, both tied to the same underlying issue of who she was allowed to speak with and how she was using the limited privilege she had. Taken together, those two incidents alone stripped away nearly 3 months of her access to video calls across a single calendar year, which for someone with no other regular way to see or hear from the outside world is a significant loss. If you are enjoying this breakdown, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a like. It helps this channel keep bringing you cases like this one every single week, and we have a lot more coming. Now let's talk about what happens when staff go looking for contraband, because this is where her file gets even more detailed. Cell searches inside the facility are called shakedowns, and they are exactly as thorough as they sound. Staff tear through bunks, personal storage, and clothing, looking for anything that should not be there. During a search in September 2024, staff reported finding nearly 30 bottles of paint, craft and jewelry making supplies including charms, and a large stack of what the report described as fake currency, styled after board game money. None of that sounds serious on the surface, and it is easy to hear a list like paint and charms and assume the whole thing is overblown. But inside a maximum security facility, uniformity and controlled property are treated as genuine security issues, not lifestyle preferences. Altered state-issued clothing and stockpiled unauthorized items are read by staff as a deliberate workaround of the rules. And if someone can hide craft supplies and altered fabric from routine checks, the real question becomes what else they might be capable of concealing. Reports show contraband was not a one-time issue either, with multiple separate citations logged for possession of contraband and for stealing or embezzling property. Meaning this was not a single search that turned up an unusual haul, but a recurring category across her entire file. Then there is the medication incident, arguably the most serious entry in her entire file. In January 2025, staff reported finding medication prescribed to a different incarcerated person in Shirilla's possession. According to the hearing paperwork, she told staff the pills were prenatal vitamins that she had gotten from someone else, and she denied that a photograph connected to the incident showed any drug use. Regardless of her explanation, prescription medication inside a prison is treated as one of the most serious forms of contraband there is. It fuels an internal black market. It raises the risk of misuse and conflict between inmates who have very little else to bargain with. The violation was formally logged as misuse of authorized medication, and it remains one of the most serious tickets tied to her name, sitting apart from the more minor contraband citations in terms of how seriously the facility treated it. On top of contraband and medication, there is the matter of count violations. Reports describe a repeated pattern of what staff call being out of place, meaning she was not where she was supposed to be during mandatory head counts, appearing at least 7 separate times in her file. If that phrase does not mean much to you, here is why it matters so much inside a correctional facility. Count time is treated as close to sacred. Staff have to account for every single person in the building, and if the numbers do not add up, the entire facility can be placed into lockdown while officers track down the discrepancy. An inmate being out of place over and over is not a one-time inconvenience. It disrupts the entire population and puts every staff member on edge each time it happens. 7 separate citations for the exact same underlying issue, spread out across her time in custody, suggests this was never a single misunderstanding about where she was supposed to stand. It reads as a repeated choice, made again and again, despite whatever consequences followed the first, second, and third time it happened. Records also describe multiple citations for disobedience of a direct order, disrespect toward another person, and at least one instance where she was written up for creating a disturbance by talking during a mandatory count. Each of those categories exists in a prison rulebook for a reason that has nothing to do with pettiness. A direct order from staff is meant to be followed immediately, without negotiation, because in a facility housing hundreds of people, hesitation or defiance in the moment can escalate a situation quickly. Disrespect citations exist to preserve the basic working relationship between staff and inmates, since that relationship is what keeps day-to-day operations functioning without constant conflict. And disturbances during count, even something as small as talking when everyone is supposed to be silent and accounted for, slow down a process that the entire facility depends on running smoothly multiple times a day. There is also a documented sexual harassment and dress code citation tied to an incident where staff accused her of repeatedly wearing altered, tightly fitted clothing that did not meet facility standards. According to that report, when a staff member attempted to confiscate the altered garment, Shirilla said she could not remove it without exposing herself underneath, and the employee alleged she had deliberately come to the unit dressed that way. Dress code inside a facility like this is not a matter of personal style. State-issued clothing is standardized specifically so that staff can identify inmates at a glance, prevent the concealment of contraband inside altered seams or hems, and maintain a uniform, controlled environment across the entire population. An altered garment is a small thing on its own, but repeated altering, paired with an incident staff characterized as harassment, becomes a much bigger entry in the file than the clothing itself would suggest. And her most recent guilty finding on record, logged just this year, is for refusing to carry out an assigned job detail, meaning even now, 3 years into her sentence, new violations are still landing in her file. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. It is not an old citation from her first disorienting weeks in custody. It is recent, current, and it shows that whatever combination of structure, restriction, and consequence the facility has applied so far has not fully broken the pattern that started almost as soon as she arrived. There is a version of this story where every one of these entries gets read as a young woman struggling to adapt to the loss of freedom that comes with a life sentence. That reading is not unreasonable on its own. Long-term isolation and rigid structure are genuinely difficult for anyone to adjust to, especially someone who was barely out of her teenage years when she was taken into custody. Reports describing her private phone calls with family have quoted her describing intense boredom, saying at one point that she did not even know how to make a book last, a small detail that speaks to just how much empty time she is facing behind those walls. But there is another reading of the same file, one the state's own paperwork leans toward more heavily the longer this pattern continues. 32 separate guilty findings across 36 filed reports is not the profile of someone struggling through 1 or 2 isolated incidents. It is the profile of someone repeatedly testing and repeatedly crossing the boundaries set for her across nearly every category a facility tracks, from contraband to visitation to direct orders to job performance. Both readings get debated constantly online, and reasonable people land in different places on it. What is not up for debate is what actually appears in the record itself, entry after entry, hearing after hearing. In response to the pattern, the facility has taken a fairly direct approach. Inmates serving long sentences in Ohio who are physically able to work are required to hold a job assignment, and Shirilla has been placed in food service, working in the prison kitchen for a standard inmate wage that tops out around $24 a month. It is not framed as a privilege. It is structure, plain and simple, meant to fill the hours that have otherwise produced so many conduct reports, and to place her under closer supervision during the parts of the day when trouble tends to start. Working in a prison kitchen means early mornings, hot and loud industrial equipment, and hours spent preparing and serving meals to hundreds of other inmates before cleaning down the entire space afterward. It is physically demanding, closely supervised, and designed specifically to leave less unstructured time for the kind of behavior that keeps showing up elsewhere in her file. Whether that structure is actually working is an open question worth sitting with, given that her most recent guilty finding is a refusal to carry out that very assignment. The consequences attached to all of this have piled up right alongside the violations themselves. Records show commissary restrictions running as long as 90 days, package restrictions, cell and bed restrictions, day room restrictions, recreation restrictions, and multiple electronics restrictions layered on top of the video visitation bans that keep making headlines. Every one of those restrictions strips away a small piece of the limited comfort and connection available to someone serving a life sentence, and every one of them gets logged permanently into a file that does not reset, does not expire, and does not get forgotten. Commissary access, for context, is often the only way an inmate can purchase basic hygiene items, snacks, or writing supplies beyond what the facility issues by default. So losing that access for 90 days at a time is a meaningful daily consequence, not a symbolic one. That permanence is exactly why this file matters so much, beyond the day-to-day consequences it carries right now. Prison records are not wiped clean at the end of a calendar year. Every guilty finding stays attached to an inmate's institutional history for good, and that history is precisely what a parole board reviews when deciding whether someone gets released. When Shirilla becomes eligible on October 29, 2037, the board will not just be looking at the crime that put her there. They will be looking at a documented pattern of contraband, unauthorized medication, repeated count violations, refused work assignments, a sexual harassment citation, 2 separate visitation violations, and a growing list of restrictions tied to nearly every privilege the facility has to offer. None of that disappears with time. All of it becomes part of the case the board weighs against her, alongside whatever conduct she manages to demonstrate between now and then. If you have made it this far, go ahead and subscribe if you have not already, because we track cases like this one all the way through, and this is far from the last update we will have on her file. It is worth remembering just how long that stretch actually is. Shirilla will be in her early 30s by the time she first sits in front of that board, more than a decade removed from the sentence that started it all. That means the file she is building right now, in her early 20s, is not some distant footnote easily set aside with time. It is the opening chapter of the exact record parole officials will pull up first, and it will sit permanently alongside whatever behavior she manages to show in the years leading up to that hearing. A parole board weighing a decision more than a decade away is not going to give much weight to promises about future behavior when the file in front of them already documents this many broken promises within the first 3 years alone. There is also a wider conversation happening around this case that goes well beyond the prison walls. Renewed public attention to her story has brought several women who say they served time alongside Shirilla forward with their own accounts of her behavior behind bars, describing everything from her reputation among other inmates to claims about her attitude in the unit. Some of those accounts describe her as difficult to get along with inside the housing unit. Others describe more specific claims about her personal conduct and relationships with other incarcerated women. None of those second-hand accounts carry the same weight as the official conduct reports themselves, since they come from individuals with their own histories, motivations, and incentives for speaking publicly, and they deserve to be treated with appropriate caution rather than taken at face value. But they have added fuel to an already active public debate about who this young woman really is, 3 years into a sentence that could keep her locked up for the rest of her life, and they have kept her name circulating well beyond the original crash that put her in custody. Her mother has continued to defend her publicly, describing a daughter who is struggling to adjust and asking people to remember the person behind the headlines. That instinct is understandable, coming from any parent watching their child navigate a life sentence, especially one that began when that child was barely more than a teenager herself. Parents in that position often find themselves fighting two battles at once, defending their child's character to a skeptical public while also quietly hoping for some sign of real change behind the walls. But that public defense sits in direct tension with a state-issued paper trail documenting guilty finding after guilty finding, hearing after hearing, all pointing toward a pattern the prison system does not appear willing to overlook, no matter how the family chooses to frame it publicly. That tension is really the core of why this story keeps generating so much attention. On one side, there is a family asking the public to see a young woman who is struggling, isolated, and trying to find her footing in an environment that was never designed to be comfortable in any sense. On the other side, there is an institution whose job is to enforce rules evenly, regardless of a person's age, background, or how sympathetic their circumstances might look from the outside. Guards are not logging 32 guilty findings because they have something personal against one specific inmate. They are responding, report by report, hearing by hearing, to documented behavior that keeps repeating itself, month after month, year after year, since the day she first arrived at the facility. Whether that behavior reflects genuine defiance, a slow psychological toll from years of isolation, or some mix of both, is exactly the kind of question without a clean, satisfying answer, and it is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly in either direction. What both sides of that debate can agree on, at minimum, is that the file itself is real, extensively documented, and growing larger with each passing year. What is not in question is the sheer scope of what her file already contains after just 3 years. A 60-day video visitation ban and an earlier 30-day electronics restriction, both tied to unauthorized visitor contact. A cell search turning up nearly 30 bottles of paint alongside craft supplies and altered clothing. A separate incident involving another inmate's prescription medication. At least 7 citations for being out of place during count. Multiple write-ups for disobedience, disrespect, and disturbing the unit. A sexual harassment and dress code citation. And now, most recently, a refusal to carry out a job assignment. Stack all of that side by side, and it becomes very hard to describe this as anything other than a sustained, ongoing pattern, rather than a series of unrelated missteps scattered across 3 difficult years. It also helps to look at how these categories compare to one another in terms of frequency, because the file is not evenly distributed across every type of rule. Being out of place during count is by far the single most repeated citation, appearing more often than any other category. Contraband-related citations come in as a close second, spanning multiple separate incidents rather than one large search. Disobedience of direct orders and disrespect towards staff each appear multiple times as well. The more serious, standalone incidents, the medication violation, the sexual harassment citation, and the 2 visitation violations, are fewer in number but carry heavier individual consequences, which is part of why they tend to draw the most public attention, even though the sheer volume of minor citations arguably says more about the day-to-day reality of her time in custody. So here is where that leaves things right now. A woman serving a life sentence, more than a decade away from her first realistic shot at parole, with a disciplinary file that keeps growing almost as fast as the years pass. Every violation adds one more entry to a record that will not fade, will not reset, and will not be forgotten by the time she finally sits in front of a parole board. Whatever happens next, that file is going to be there waiting, page after page, the moment she asks the state to let her go home. And no amount of public sympathy or family advocacy changes what is actually written down inside it. It is also worth stepping back and asking what a case like this says about the wider system she is now part of. Long sentences handed down to very young offenders create a particular kind of challenge for correctional facilities, one that goes beyond any single inmate. Someone entering custody at 19 or 20, facing a sentence measured in decades rather than years, is being asked to adapt to an environment built around routine, restriction, and supervision at an age when most people are still figuring out who they are outside of any institution at all. Some facilities have started experimenting with additional programming aimed specifically at younger inmates serving long sentences, though it remains an open question in the broader corrections field whether that kind of programming meaningfully reduces disciplinary issues over time, or whether the sheer weight of a life sentence tends to produce this kind of pattern regardless of what support is offered along the way. Shirilla's file, at least so far, reads like a case study in exactly that unresolved question, 3 years in and still adding new entries with no clear sign of the pattern slowing down. We are going to keep tracking this case closely, especially as her parole eligibility date gets closer and more of these records continue to surface. Cases like this rarely stay quiet for long, and given how much attention this one has already drawn, it is safe to assume more documents, more hearings, and more updates on her conduct file are still ahead. If you want to see where this goes next, make sure you are subscribed, because we will be covering the next chapter of Mackenzie Shirilla's time behind bars the moment there is something new to report.